Greetings. My name is Dr. Crystal Collier, and I'd like to welcome you guys to the Family Recovery Conference. The presentation that I'll be responsible for today is called The Neuroscience of High-Risk Behavior, Implications for Individuals and Families. So I'm a person in long-term recovery that's struggled with addiction since I was a very young age. I started studying this topic to help me understand why I made some of the decisions that I made when I was young that put me in positions to hurt myself, my family, my education. And so what I'm going to share with you today is kind of a summary of everything that I've learned over the years. And so I am a therapist by trade. I also do teaching here in Houston as well as research. And I speak to parents all the time. And I get asked this question quite a lot. Is it really so bad? You know, Dr. Collier, I drank when I was a student in high school and I'm okay. Or I smoked a little weed when I was in college and I seem to be fine. My kids tell me that it is a medicine. Is it really that bad? The way that I answer this question, and hopefully you will too, to your children, is by saying this. About 90% of adult addicts began engaging in their high-risk behavior when they were an adolescent. There's something magical that's going on that if drugs and alcohol are added to the mix can have a really negative effect. This chart actually shows us that the younger somebody is when they start using, the greater their risk of growing up and struggling with an addiction. But as you can see, this chart actually starts to decrease. And so what this says is as students delay substance use up until the age of 21, that they can almost completely ameliorate their risk of struggling with an addiction as an adult. And so when I looked at this chart, I thought this is really amazing. I mean, it's steadily going down. If we just wait until we're 21, and then I thought, why is it that if we wait until we're 21 that we reduce our risk so greatly? And the answer lies within the fragile stage of brain development that's going on between the ages of about 11 and 25. So we know that there are about two big stages of brain development as we grow. Phase 1, between birth and about age 11, 12, we're growing about 200 billion neurons. And then at around puberty, about age 11, 12, what we see is that the growth of neurons stops and the pruning begins. We actually prune away and lose about 50% of our neurons, ending up with about 100 billion by the time we're 24, 25 years old. Now, this is really interesting because we're losing half of our brain cells. But I promise you guys, it's not because of all the high-risk behavior what we did. It's really a normal stage of phase 2 brain development. What's happening is we're actually growing a couple substances. They're just not more neurons. So let me show you what we're growing. We're actually growing this substance called myelin. Now, this is a big picture of a neuron. And so you can see we've got the cell body and the axon and all these dendrites. And then we have this substance right here, myelin. Now, that starts to thicken as we hit puberty. And what I learned about the myelin sheath is that this is a fatty tissue that helps move electricity down the axon. And the thicker the myelin is, the faster thinkers we are. Scientists call this processing speed. And so our processing speed actually peaks at the age of 25. And as you guys know, who are over the age of 25, it's about slowly all downhill from there. So we want our children to have the fastest, most efficient processing speed we can. The second thing that's growing are these things called dendrites that reach out to other cells, making long pathways of neuronal connections. Now, I learned that this is actually the hardware. Dendrites are the hardware of learning. The more we practice something, the more we learn, the more dendrites we grow. It's actually the structure that connects our cells, making more complicated strings for our skills. And so the more skills we have, the more long pathways of neuronal connections we'll have in our brain. Let me show you what it looks like. So this is a picture of an infant neuron. And as this infant grows up to about 18 months, you can see the thickening of the myelin even then, and the connecting of all those new dendrites that are reaching out to other cells. This is absolutely what we want right here. Long strings of complicated pathways for our learning, our skills. And here is what it looks like over time. So this is a picture taken back in about 1999 by Dr. Jay Geed and his associates. And what you see is healthy adolescent brains as they're growing through development. Now, you'll probably notice that the brain development is happening in a very specific part of the brain, right behind the forehead, about halfway up the skull, in an area of the brain known as the frontal lobes or the prefrontal cortex. Now, you can see that when we're young, here's age 5 and about age 8, we do have a prefrontal cortex. It's just really young and underdeveloped, which is totally fine because we rely on our parents' frontal lobes anyway. But then we hit puberty, and that growth is starting to happen. But remember, the growth is in myelin and dendrites. And so as you can see here, the darker the color, the less gray matter. Gray matter equals actually cells. So what our brain starts doing is it starts pruning away cells to make room for that myelin and for those dendrites. And so then at about age 16 here, we've got about 45–50% of our adult brain, our frontal lobes. When we're about 20, we have about 80% of our total adult brain. We still have a whole fifth of our brain development between the ages of 20 and 25. A lot is happening there. Now, what's quite important to remember about this stage is that it is governed by a very specific principle that I think all parents and educators and clinicians, anybody who works with kids, should know this principle. This principle is called the use it or lose it principle. And so what this basically says is that if you are using a string of neurons, a long pathway of neurons, if there's blood flow and electrical activity moving down those neurons, then you will keep them. And those are the neurons that you'll make long strings of complicated connections for. But the neurons that you don't use so much are the ones that literally get pruned away to make space for dendrites and for myelin. So here's what I want you to use, is your frontal lobe executive functioning skills. So it's quite interesting because we grow executive functioning skills throughout our entire phases of development. The beginning phases, we grow executive functioning skills like task initiation and concentration and organization. Those kind of get us up and get us ready to go in the morning, right, and functioning. But when we hit phase 2, these are the specific executive functioning skills that our brain is really focusing on. So we move from the very concrete thinking of childhood into abstract conceptual understanding to be able to understand the gray areas. I mean, life is just not black and white. We have to be able to understand concepts that we can't see, feel, or touch to be able to think in more mature ways. We also have the executive functioning skill of impulse control. It's the frontal lobe that is the seat of all of our impulse control, our self-control of our lower level limbic reactions. And then we are able to do complex problem solving and decision making, which hopefully result in us having good judgment. We also are able to regulate our emotions and handle the frustrations of adulting in ways that we didn't when we were younger. And you guys, this last one, the ability to feel empathy, it's this part of our brain that lights up like a Christmas tree when we connect with other people. Remember that, you guys. So it's the frontal lobe that when it connects with other people actually lights up. This is the part of the brain that has lots of mirror neurons. So when somebody else is going through happiness or pain, we can have the skill of empathy to be able to imagine what they're feeling and going through, even if we've never gone through that ourselves. Very important part of the brain. Okay, so now that you've had your little brain primer, we're going to move into the big question of the day is how do drugs and alcohol affect brain development, especially during this really sensitive pruning process in phase 2 between ages 11 and 25. Now, to answer that question, we have to understand another part of the brain, one of my favorites called the limbic system. So most people know this part of the brain as the fight or flight part of the brain. We've had it since caveman days, quite old. This is my favorite picture of it right here in the blue. You can see this 3D image of these little teeny tiny organelles that are all protected by those fatty lobes. Well, the limbic system, interestingly enough, is also where all pleasurable experiences begin and end. And that's what we're going to focus on today is the pleasure reward process. And so it all has to do with this wonderful neurotransmitter dopamine. Most people know that dopamine is the neurotransmitter of reward. Now, there are a lot of other neurotransmitters evolved in how we feel, like serotonin and norepinephrine and GABA. But when it comes to doing good things for our survival, that reward cascade always ends in the increase of dopamine. So dopamine is that neurotransmitter that tells us there's something in our environment that's salient or that it's good for our survival. And so I'll give you an example of kind of how this happens. So if you haven't eaten anything for about 4, 5, 6 hours, you start to feel maybe kind of hangry and grumpy, moody. Well, it's interesting that your brain makes you feel mood symptoms when you're hungry. But basically, your limbic system is saying, if you don't go get something to eat, then I'm going to make you feel really uncomfortable by depleting your levels of dopamine. And then as soon as you eat, you get a 100% increase in dopamine. And your limbic system says, hey, you just did a good job keeping me alive. Here's your reward. Now, when human beings have sexual behavior, when we're married and protected, right, kids, right? What happens is we get a 150% increase in dopamine. What's basically going on is that your limbic system is saying, wow, this is really good for your survival and your species survival, so here's your reward. Now, if somebody were to ingest a line of cocaine, they would get a dopamine increase of about 350%. If they use methamphetamine, it's about an 1100% increase in dopamine. I learned that heroin is about a 1300% increase in dopamine. It's interesting because I can't even put heroin on this chart because if I did, it would skew. You wouldn't be able to see food or sex anymore. But if you think about it, it's kind of what happens with people who become addicted to opioids or heroin. One of the first things they stop doing is eating, having relationships with other people. You guys, that little limbic system, remember, it's not the thinker. The frontal lobe's the thinker. So what happens is that we have this pleasure threshold that we exceed. Let me show you. This is it. Our brain goes up and down with dopamine all day long, but we're supposed to stay within this, what they call a hedonic threshold. And so, you eat and your dopamine goes back up. Maybe you get bored or lonely. You call a friend or go to the gym or you do something like smiling. Smiling increases dopamine levels. It's just your body's natural feedback loop that tells you what you need to survive all day. But something pretty amazing happens when we go above this threshold. Scientists believe that a couple things happen. One, that we start to damage the receptor sites that are already in our limbic system, and thus reducing the amount of dopamine that we have available to us. But two, another thing that happens is that we actually flood those little synapses in there with way too much dopamine. And so scientists believe that what also happens is that our brain learns. It grows new dendrites, more and more and more receptor sites on those dendrites for dopamine. And then when all that dopamine leaves the system, you have all these new structures, all these new receptor sites in your brain that are now screaming out for dopamine. And this describes really well the process of tolerance building. The more you expose your brain to dopamine, the more your brain will create new structure, the more it learns, the more that it leaves your system, the more those extra receptor sites in there will start craving. And so you can see that sometimes this process happens maybe slowly and sometimes it happens quickly, depending upon what substance that you're putting into your body and how much it spikes dopamine levels. And so this black line represents the hedonic threshold of most people. But if you're like me and you have a genetic predisposition to addiction, what that means is that you actually may make a little bit less dopamine. You may make, store, or synthesize a little bit less dopamine than other people. And that means your hedonic threshold will be here, this red line. It's actually a condition called the reward deficiency syndrome. And so let me tell you a story that kind of illustrates this. My client gave me permission to use her story because it's a pretty good one. But a few years ago, I had a young student come to see me when she was about 16, and she walks in my office and she says, "Hey, you're the brain lady. You came to my middle school and you did this awesome presentation about how substances affect the brain." She said, "I quit smoking pot for like a whole month." And so I thought, okay, great, but what happened? And she said, "Well, you know, my grandparents have custody over me and they don't watch me very well and all my friends were doing it. But check this out. When I got to high school, my BFF and we created this safety plan. And so if she went to a party, I'd go with her. And if she drank this much, I would drink this much. If she smoked something, I'd smoke something. If she took one pill, I would take one pill." And so now I'm thinking that she's about 16 years old, which means her frontal lobe is only about 16. She's got about 45–50% of her executive functioning skills. So this safety plan of hers, kind of 45–50%, makes sense. So I asked her, "All right, how's that working for you?" And she said, "Well, to be honest with you, my friend will want to stop drinking at some point and I want to keep going. And so I will kind of sometimes sneak it behind her back." And she said, and then there are times when, she won't want to take anymore and I do. And so I'll sneak a little bit behind her back then too. But I always end up doing too much or I get sick and she's fine and never gets into trouble. So my first question for this beautiful young lady was, "Do you have any genetic history of addiction?" And she says, "Duh, that's why my parents lost custody of me, because they're addicts and they're still using to this day." And so it's interesting because this chart kind of shows you where her hedonic threshold might be, this red line, whereas her best friend, who sounds like she has no genetic history, could be this black line. And so even though they start off spiking their dopamine levels equally as high, all she has to do is spike to this red line, and her brain will start making those structural changes little by little by little, which means her tolerance goes up. Her best friend's doesn't. Her best friend would have had to use and spike dopamine levels above this line before her brain started making those structural changes. But it sounded like she got sick before she did that and just didn't want to. So I love this chart because it shows you how anybody could get addicted to any substance that spikes dopamine levels high. And it also shows you how people who have the genetic predisposition are at a greater risk if they expose themselves to too much dopamine from drugs or alcohol or other dopamine spiking behaviors. Now let me show you what it looks like in the brain. So this is a functional MRI, and it shows you a slice of the brain going this way, but we're looking from the top down. And so what you see is a brain that's been taken a picture of 1 second apart, and the top brain is showing a picture of somebody who has maybe not had any drugs or alcohol in their system. And this is what you'd see. You'd see the brain lit up. The different colors indicate blood flow and electrical activity. And so in your brain right now, if you are completely sober and you have a healthy brain and body, this is what your brain should look like, these three at the top here. And so what you see is that all parts of the brain are on and working together in a nice integrated way. Now, the bottom three pictures might indicate somebody who's been binge drinking. This could also be a picture of somebody who's been using drugs or pornography or food addiction. It's interesting because a lot of the studies that are coming in on process addictions are showing results that are extremely similar to this. What you see is the limbic system back here. And remember, we're looking from the top down. So the limbic system looks like it's kind of in the back here, is lit up full of dopamine. But what you'll notice is that the frontal lobe, or the prefrontal cortex, looks like it's off. And that's exactly what happens, is the blood flow and electrical activity moves into the limbic system because the brain is tricked into thinking that you've done what it needs to survive. That you've done everything that you need to survive because your limbic system is full of dopamine. And so it shuts off your frontal lobe. So you don't really need it at that moment. And so this is interesting because, you know, maybe we do this to ourselves like on Thanksgiving if we overeat, or if we've had a pretty, interesting night of drinking and we did a little bit too much. This might be what our brain might look like. And, you know, if you're an adult and your brain is fully grown and you don't do that very often, hopefully that won't have big negative consequences for you. But what if you are in between the ages of 11 and 25 and your frontal lobe is growing? And if you do this to that frontal lobe a lot, if the frontal lobe is off, does it get to grow? Now the answer to that is no. And we call that arrested development. This is a kind of a good example. If somebody starts using here at about the age of 12 and they keep using all the way up until they're about age 20, you won't see a brain that looks like that if you took a picture of it. They may look more like this at 16, and if they were regular daily users, you may even see a brain that looks like this, very arrested. Now, hopefully you're putting two and two together here, because if this person stops at the age of 20, they have 5 years of brain development left, which means their brain could potentially heal and catch back up. But what if this person didn't stop? What if they kept using all the way until they were 25 years old and their brain was done developing? What would have happened is they would have peaked at the moment when they began using regularly. So instead of their executive functioning skills peaking here, they would peak much lower, and then that's what they would have to use and utilize for the rest of their life. That would be their baseline. Now remember, we grow new dendrites for the rest of our lives so we can learn. But if you're learning with lower executive functioning skills than you should have gotten, your processing speed is going to be less, which means your ability to take in and learn information is going to be less. You will suffer with the effects of arrested development, potentially for a long time. And here's how long it takes us to heal. This study shows you a picture of a normal healthy brain at the top. All the blood flow to all parts of the brain are on. But it also shows you a cocaine abuser's brain about 10 days sober. Now, this brain is still in detox. That poor little limbic system is screaming out for that thing it thinks it needs to survive, and the frontal lobe's still off. But even at about 100 days sober, you can see that there's only about 50% of the blood flow that's moved back into the frontal lobes. So it takes a long time. And some studies say that it may take up to a year and a half before this brain can return to normal levels of functioning. And some studies say that it could potentially, for heroin or opioid addicts, take up to 5 years. And so can you imagine, trying to live life on life's terms when your frontal lobe is only halfway on, and trying to stay sober and get your life together can be quite difficult, which translates into higher relapse rates. Okay, so you guys, there are a lot of substances out there that spike dopamine levels at varying amounts. And so we've studied a few of them. I want to talk about a couple. The first one is alcohol. So this is a study that shows you the brain scans of two 15-year-old males while they were taking a memory test. Now, what you see in the non-drinking 15-year-old is a lot of electrical activity and blood flow moving to the parts of the brain that this kiddo needs to take the memory test. Compared to our heavy drinker over here, who doesn't have as much blood flow and electrical activity. But what you'll also notice about this brain is the structural differences between the two. Now, remember that process we talked about earlier. As your brain grows new dendrites and reaches out to other cells to make those long strings, your brain needs to kind of fold in on itself to make room for all of those pathways. And so you can see a lot of those folds happening here in this non-drinker's brain. But look what's happening over here. What you see is the effects of arrested development, and that structure is just not growing like the other kiddo. Now, if we move over to talk about marijuana, you guys, I'm sure, are quite aware that it started to be genetically modified to have higher and higher levels of THC a few decades ago. And what we're seeing now is that it's a much more potent drug than it used to be. In about 1970, it was anywhere from 2 to 3% THC. And I know here in Houston, in around 2016, it was up to 17 to 26%. And I know that in some states where it's legal recreationally and medicinally, that it's up to potentially 99% THC levels. There's no cap because there's no regulation on many of those things. And so this is a kind of a good example of what you might see marijuana use doing to an adolescent's brain. Now, this is a different kind of brain scan. This is called a SPECT scan. And what you're seeing here is brain connectivity. And so in a normal healthy brain, you're going to see the brain activity in neurons all over that brain. So there should be no holes. It should be nice and smooth, meaning all those neurons are well connected and working together. Now, in these two guys who have a history of marijuana use, what you kind of see is that it looks like there's holes in the brain. Well, it's not necessarily really holes. It's actually areas that don't have activity in them because they lack connectivity. And you can see that the big chunk of their frontal lobes is where they're missing a lot of that connectivity. Those executive functioning skills are literally arrested. And this is a really unfortunate but beautiful picture of what that looks like. And we're looking actually again from the top down. Now, let's move on to different substances. So, different behaviors. So we know that there are a lot of different behaviors out there that we can become addicted to because they spike levels of dopamine, some potentially just as high as some drugs out there. And so this is kind of interesting because there's been a lot of studies done now about food addiction, sex addiction, pornography addiction. And so I wanted to show you one particular study about food addiction. You may have some mouth watering when you see this picture. or your mouth may water when you see this picture. Some people maybe are more carb addicts like me, and some people may be more sugar addicts. But there was an interesting study done on sugar addiction, and they took a picture of a person's brain, and this is actually looking from the back forward. And so this person has no eating disorder issues, no food addiction, and it shows their brain activity right after they ate sugar. So our brain loves sugar, right? It's brain food. It turns into glucose and tastes good. But this is what it should look like kind of in a healthy brain with no sugar addiction. But this is a picture of a person who has sugar addiction just after ingesting sugar. What you can see is that the entire brain looks quite lit up, but from the back looking forward, here's the limbic system on either side of the base of the brain there. And you can see it is lit up full of dopamine. This is a brain that's been exposed to sugar so many times that they've made structural changes to that brain. All those new receptor sites in there are screaming out for the dopamine that is increased with sugar. And remember, you guys, once we make those structural changes to our brain, we can't unmake them. This is why we have that saying, once an addict, always an addict, because those are new structures. We can't unmake them. Now, technology addiction. A lot of you guys have been wondering how healthy technology is, especially for your younger kids. We have a lot of studies about technology addiction, primarily from Asia. This is a picture of an Asian internet cafe. And technology is so completely changed our world, and in Asian countries particularly, they've had to put in different sidewalks to delineate technology walkers, because they won't look up from their technology and are walking out into traffic and damaging themselves. It really has changed our world quite a bit, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worst. So this study was done in Japan on a group, two groups of adolescents. So they studied one group of adolescents that used the internet for a few minutes a day. And they looked at brain connectivity. And in this study, if you actually were to connect the red dots, you would see the brain connectivity of the healthy adolescents who only surfed for a few minutes a day. Then they looked at the brain connectivity of a group of adolescents who were on the internet for 12 or more hours a day. They frequented the internet cafes and stayed there all day. And so what you see in these purple lines are the brain connectivity of the internet addict adolescents. Now, it's interesting. This is a beautiful, albeit unfortunate, example of the use it or lose it principle, because you can see right here, if we're looking on the top down from the brain, this bottom one, there's a lot of dense connections in the brain right here. Well, this area is the sensory and motor cortex of the brain, and you can see that's the part of the brain they're using the most. So think use it or lose it. That indicates that they're using that part of their brain a lot more often. But look at how many connections these guys have into their prefrontal cortexes. You can see it better here. Minimal when compared to the healthy adolescents. Let's talk just briefly about the elephant in the room that usually no parent wants to discuss with their children, and that's the hook of pornography. And so it's really interesting because this is digitally rewiring some of our brains, especially our children's brains as they're growing through that phase too. It's so disturbing to me because, you know, a child may see a pornography clip online that spikes their dopamine level high, and then all they have to do is within 1 or 2 clicks find another video that could potentially spike the dopamine levels higher. Within a 30-minute video, pornography watching time period, you may spike your dopamine levels as high as if you were using cocaine. It completely rewires our brain. And then when a child is in the presence of a real live human, the dopamine spike that comes from that interaction is not half as high as the dopamine spike that comes from the pornography. And so we're seeing issues with erectile dysfunction in our young people because they, the dopamine spike from real live humans just can't compete with the dopamine spike from porn. We're going to move and talk about video games for just a moment. This is a pretty interesting study that was done on college-age students who played a video game. So they had a control group that didn't play any games and a 2-week video game group that played Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And what you see is functional MRI studies done while these guys were taking an empathy exam. So remember, empathy and connection to other people is a frontal lobe skill. And so what we should see is just what we see here in our baseline levels, is the frontal lobe is nice and lit up when they're taking their empathy test. And for the guys who didn't play a video game, you can see very similar results in their frontal lobes when they take the same empathy test over 2 weeks. But if you compare this to these scans of these guys who are taking the same empathy test with a marked diminishment in blood flow and electrical activity in their frontal lobes. And it was interesting, when they asked these guys, like, what are you thinking? They say, well, I'm playing a first-person shooter game for hours a day, and I kind of have to dumb down my empathy so that I can kill these people. And the good news is that when these guys stopped playing the video game after a couple weeks, they came back for another test, and all of them had actually gone back to baseline levels, which is good because, remember, use it or lose it. If you don't use those empathy skills, they arrest and they don't develop. And so, if these guys had continued to play all the way up until 24, 25, they may lack a lot of empathy that other people have because they had to dumb that part of their brain down in order to play violent video games. So it's important to remember that video game manufacturers have hired teen testers for years, hook them up to all these different types of scans and machines to see when their body responses indicate higher levels and spikes of dopamine. And then they record the code that that child just played when they had a big dopamine spike, and they give that back to the game manufacturers who put more of that code in the video games. And so it seems kind of unfair that this is a mass-produced addiction, really. Very much kind of like how the food industry puts sugar into foods that don't even need to be sweet because they know that sugar is addictive for us. So if you're worried that you have a child that may have addiction to any type of video game or internet or social media addictions, you can go to this website, netaddiction.com, and have your child take one of the tests. It's interesting that if you have a couple of these, you may want to think about changing your behavior or restructuring your child's technology use. But if you've got 6 or more of these, you're going to need some help. You're going to need some professional help with somebody who knows how to help with addiction to this. So you guys, we're going to switch and move toward the end of our presentation and discuss prevention and recovery. So you can see I've got long strings of neurons here to show you on this slide. And that's what I want you to focus in on. If you're a parent, I want you to change your performance-based praise and use something that I call brain-based praise. Brain-based praise means that you know your executive functioning skills and which ones show up at different levels of your child's neurodevelopment. Here's the ones that are showing up in elementary, middle school, and then as we switch over and our brain starts to grow and develop around middle, high school, these higher level executive functioning skills are starting to grow. And you guys have the power of use it or lose it principle. And so imagine if you use rewarding praise language with these skills, what you'll see are those skills will go up. So instead of saying, All right, son, great work. What I want you to say is, wow, I really liked how you solved that problem. Tell me how you did that. And instead of saying, good job, I want you to say, wow, I really, I liked how you, controlled your emotions today. What was happening in your mind? I like how you were thinking about that at a different level. You really controlled your impulses today. A very nice self-control. Memorize these skills. Require your kids to use them. Make sure that, no more gifts unless it's birthday or Christmas. As soon as your child turns 11, 12 years old, that's when their phase 2 brain development starts. And so you as a parent have the use it or lose it principle on your side. But if your children get everything and they don't have to solve problems or delay gratification or use these higher level skills, then they're going to have long strings of neurons for dependency upon you and not these beautiful executive functioning skills that, if they grow, will allow your children to make better decisions. There was a really beautiful long-term study that was done on adolescents to figure out how many of them used high-risk behavior when they were kids, how they chose to stay away, and what they chose to do. They studied 16,000 kids for a few decades, and they found that a large percentage of kids say no to high-risk behavior in high school, and a large percentage of kids who experiment actually only do so 1 or 2 times, and then they end up saying no throughout the rest of high school. And when you ask those kids, what was the major reason that you said no or you stopped? The number one answer was, my mom would kick my butt. They need to know what our rules are and what the consequences will be. So let's talk about what prevention science says works. So we need to be able to utilize all of the tools on this list. You could actually get your child's GAR score, which is a genetic test that shows you their score for how many genetic polymorphisms they have in their genes. If you do have any kind of genetic predisposition in your family history, you may want to really consider getting your GARS score, G-A-R-S, genetic testing. Can you imagine if you were able to have your child's genetic information and know their percentage risk of becoming an addict as an adult, how you could start prevention earlier and make sure that you get them involved in lots of really great dopamine spiking pro-social activities, made sure that they were as connected as they possibly could, and worked with them on any kind of sensation-seeking behavior that might spike. You also making sure that you do consistent education in the school and at home. And so I'll show you a list of different high-risk behaviors that you can do that education on. But you should be talking to your kids quite regularly about these different things and letting them know what your family code is. And so this is what you can do. You can create a family code of ethics, very simple code. In the Collier family, in my family, our family code is that we treat others with kindness, compassion, and respect on and offline. We are upstanders. We never use drugs and only alcohol when we're 21 or over. That's our family code. And what you can do is repeat that family code, every couple of months or so when you're at your family dinners or when they're leaving the house to go to a sleepover or a football game. Okay, remember the family code? And your kid will be like, yeah, our family code, blah, blah, blah. Wow, I really like your memory. Very good, very good. And so also to remember that family dinners are really critical. There's a beautiful study done on the increase and decrease of family dinners over time. And what they found is that as family dinners start to decrease, high-risk behavior increases. But they also found that as family dinners start to be reinstituted, high-risk behavior goes down. And so, kids will say, well, I don't want to have bloodshot eyes when I'm coming home having dinner with my mom or dad. We talk a lot at family dinners and we talk a lot about, what our expectations are. And so family dinners can be a really beautiful place to discuss healthy family code rules and expectations. Remember that kids, especially adolescents, they want our opinion less and less, except on crisis situations. Our kids want to know what to do and what we expect of them. Even if they don't want to do it, they really still do want to know what our expectations are. And so the next thing too is to make sure you give consistent consequences. One of the biggest mistakes that I've seen families make is that they say, oh, well, you know, I did that in high school. It's just a phase. Just don't do it again. And they kind of give a slap on the wrist. And it's interesting because when kids get no consequences for their first or second times drinking or using a substance or engaging, addictively in a high-risk behavior, what they'll translate that message as is, my parents don't care if I drink, or my parents don't care if I do that. That's how they translate you not giving them a consequence. So you guys, it's really critical that you do. And so a lot of parents will say to me, well, but you know, I want my child to call me if they make a bad choice. And if they're afraid of the consequences, they may not. So here's what you do. In your family code, you say, if you choose to go against our family rule and engage in substance use underage, there will be a consequence. But if you call me and let me know, your consequence will be a lot less. But if somebody else tells me that you've done this, your consequence will be double or triple. So it's much better if you're honest and tell me, and we will work it out. So that's how you keep them connected to you and openly calling you when they do make that choice. And then, of course, hopefully you can get your schools into proactive community education, maybe even let them know about this presentation and have them book me for a parent-teacher talk, or come to your child's high school and give this talk to them. I tell you, adolescents really love this information because, they want to know how substances affect brain development. They don't want to hear presentations about just saying no, or hearing presentations about somebody who's been there and survived something. You know, a lot of times they'll think, well, you know, if that person can get high and do all this and hit bottom and get sober, maybe I can too. So not that those are terrible for them to hear, but you always have to make sure you give them the other side of it too, that their concrete thinking doesn't interpret that as something that they can do, get away with, and then just get into rehab. We want to make sure that they have all the tools. And if a problem happens, please, you guys, treat the problem immediately. It's much better to go big with a big consequence first and let them really struggle and feel that pain of that negative consequence for that choice. They're much less likely to do it again in the future if the consequence is big enough. Now, a lot of parents will say, well, Mom, you know, I don't want my kids to think I don't trust them. And that just confuses me, because we shouldn't trust our kids altogether. When kids say to you, what, Mom, you don't trust me? I want you to say, you know what? I don't. I don't trust the part of your brain that hasn't grown and developed. Now, I do trust the part that has. You know, you're working on a pretty good frontal lobe there. But I don't trust the part that hasn't developed. And so I'm going to be your frontal lobe until you have one of your own. So I'll end you with this. I do research on these different high-risk behaviors every year. I'll do different literature reviews and see what people are studying. And then I'll use that information to give presentations for people. I've been doing a lot of vaping presentations lately and technology addiction presentations, since those are on the forefront of all of our minds. But it's important that you keep up on these things. And in your family dinners, bring articles or examples or things that you might hear in the news to the family dinner table. Hey, did you hear about that teacher that got arrested for using substances on campus? Well, that would never happen in our family, because our family code says that we don't do this. Kids, what do you think about that? That's a great way to bring those discussions to the family dinner and kind of segue into what your family code is, so that you're not lecturing, but that you're just letting them know that you love them and you want to hold them accountable for keeping their brain as clean and clear as it possibly can. And if they don't choose to do so, you will. So, you guys, this has been a pleasure, and I'd love to share my slides with you. If anybody would like to see the resources that I've used, my references, they're there. And so I'm actually writing a neurodevelopmental guide for parents right now called the Whereabouts book, and I'm hoping that it will be out next spring. And so if you would like to get on my mailing list at whereaboutsbook.com, I will send you one email when it's published, and it will have a lot more information, but very similar to what you got here, but in a book form. And I'm actually writing it in infographic style, so it will be kind of more hip, slick, and cool for younger people to read too. And if you would like to reach out to me for the slides or to book me for a speaking event, please feel free to email me at crystal at drcrystalcollier.com or give me a call at the number listed below. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the video conferences that you hear at the Family Recovery Conference. And please, you guys, take good care. Remember, you have scientific justification to be your kid's frontal lobe until they have one of their own. You don't want them to grow up with any kind of risk for addiction, and you want them to have full use of their executive functioning skills. And so there's no arrested development. You guys, take care.